In today's video, I'm going to talk about training for once. So not nutrition, we're going to talk about why we train, what we want to be doing from our training in the gym. So how do we grow muscle? How do we change the way we look? I'm going to touch on certain things that you'll hear coaches like myself say, terminology that might benefit you in the long run knowing about. And then we're going to talk about the one thing that you definitely need to be doing through any kind of training that you do, and that's called progressive overload. So I'm going to flip over to my screen now and I'm going to share a presentation with you, so I hope you enjoy it. It's a little bit longer, this one, so bear with me. The content is more scientific, but yeah, if you like it, follow, like, share, do whatever you want to do. Anyway, let's get into it. Peace. Hello guys, and welcome to my screen. So in this video I'm going to talk about how we should work out. So most of you probably know you should work out, have a gym membership, want to go to the gym, want to get in shape, or know people that partake in fitness and actually do and know people that kind of take part in fitness and enjoy it. So I'm going to try and work through some of the things that you've heard in the industry and explain them so everyone knows what we're doing, why we're doing them. We're not just doing things for the sake of them. And this way you can avoid the kind of rubbish that's in the industry. So let's get started. So in today's lesson, so these are the topics we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about why do we resistance train. So what are the benefits? What is the point of doing it? How do we grow muscle? So how do we do it? How do we create that environment? What's progressive overload? So progressive overload explained. Weight training terminology. So some of the things you would have heard that you might not necessarily understand, or if you do understand them, great, we'll go over them again. And how you can kind of train, whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced. And then we're going to have a little conclusion where I talk to you, and then we can look at steps moving forward. So let's get into it. So how do we grow muscle? Everyone thinks they know, but really science is just about getting their head around it. So in the kind of industry, growing muscle is called hypertrophy. So as simple as that. People will say, oh, I'm doing hypertrophy training. They're growing muscle. They're trying to grow muscle. And according to Brad Schoenfeld, which is pretty much the most kind of legitimate research into kind of growing muscle at the moment, at this current time, so that's in 2020, there's three mechanisms to this that we're going to talk on in a minute. Then we're going to see how we can apply these in the gym. So Brad, from his research, kind of named them three mechanisms for muscle hypertrophy. It sounds pretty simple, and they are pretty simple once you get your head around them. It's basically founded on the way that in the gym, we need to stimulate satellite cells within our muscles through a mechanical stimulus. So that mechanical stimulus is weight training. And then these cells, so the cells that we stimulate, fuse to existing cells and create new myofibers, so new muscle tissue within the body that are needed to repair and growth of the muscle that you've just damaged through the weight training. So basically, weight training is damage, then your body repairs and you do it again. So in the gym, how do we create a good stimulus? So like I said, there's three kind of areas that he looks at. There might be more, but right now, these are the kind of three that most people use and adopt to. So one is mechanical tension, two is muscular damage, and three is metabolic stress. So let's look at the first one in more detail. So for mechanical tension, we're concerned with the force generated and the stretch applied to the muscle that we're trying to work. So these two combined are key to actually growing muscle. They're the ones where you get the biggest bang for your buck. Likewise, like we're going to touch on in a minute, our ability to overload this over a period of time in the phrase called progressive overload will greatly impact our ability to grow muscle and get the physique we want. So I'm going to quote Brad Schoenfeld here. So he says, mechanical overload increases muscle mass while restricts muscle atrophy. So muscle atrophy means muscle wastage. Muscle hypertrophy means we're growing muscle. So central to this mechanical tension mechanism is the eccentric loading phase of a lift. So the eccentric phase of a lift is wherever the muscle you're working is getting longer. It's normally the lowering phase of a lift. So for example, on a bench press, the eccentric phase is when you're lowering it to your chest. In a squat, it's where you're lowering into the deep position. And this is where your muscle is getting longer whilst under load, and this has a great hypertrophic response from the research. So that's the first thing we need to make sure we're doing. So we're prioritizing the lowering portion of the lift, really slowing it down, and we're making sure we're getting better and stronger over time. So that's the first one ticked off. For number 2, muscle damage. This is caused through resistance training and creates the almost infection-like response in your muscles. So basically, when you're training, you want to be damaging your muscles. Obviously, we've touched on mechanical tension, but there's other ways. So just lifting the weights normally will create stress to your muscle, and then the infection-like response of these muscles will make them grow back bigger over time. So that's the second mechanism. Well, the third mechanism is a little bit different, and this is called metabolic stress. And this is associated with exercises in a different kind of energy system. So this is in the anaerobic glycolysis system. And for most people, for people like you and me, this means in the higher rep ranges. So this means you don't want to be scared of going into the higher rep ranges. As spending time in these kind of high rep ranges, it increases the duration of effort, and it results in the buildup of metabolites such as lactate and hydrogen ions. So this buildup of the metabolites, it is hypothesized that the body then responds to this by flooding the muscle you've just worked with nutrients, hormones, so that your body can facilitate that growth process. Obviously, this is only hypothesized at the moment. Additionally, some have argued that the increase in swelling of these cells during this type of effort can cause an adaptive response in itself. So when everyone was like, it's great to get a pump. It's great to get a pump. There may be some merit in that. So we know that in theory, but how do we actually apply that into the real world? So let's look at them in order. I know I touched them as we went through, but I'm just going to dive into them a little bit more. So to make sure you're ticking off number 1 and having sufficient mechanical tension, like I said, you want to be applying progressive overload, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we want to focus on eccentric loading. So the lowering portions of your lifts should be around 3 seconds minimum, and then you'll be covering that base. As this is the biggest mechanism of hypertrophy, I'd recommend doing this at the start of your workout where you're freshest and you've got the most energy. So put your biggest movements where you're able to move the most amount of weight with the most control at the start of your workouts, and then move on to different types of training near the end. For muscle damage, make sure that for muscle damage, we're looking at more of kind of a localized stimulus. So this can apply to more isolated exercises. So muscle damage can occur between anywhere between 6 to 30 rep ranges. However, it's kind of the general rule of thumb is to stick within the 8 to 15 rep range to create muscle damage. And lastly, to stimulate the metabolic stress response, you want to be working in a much higher rep range than you would for the muscle damage, so that you cross into the different energy systems. For example, you could use a drop set, a muscle round, or a cluster set to push your sets for longer and create that metabolic stimulus. This response can also be created through straight sets of higher reps. So we're looking to around 20 to 30 reps. But I would definitely do this at the end of your sessions, away from your more taxing mechanical tension section. So that's that section kind of ticked off. I know it sounds a bit complicated, but you don't really need to know the ins and outs. I've tried to make it as simple as possible. Just remember, there's 3 ways at the moment that we're scientifically going to grow muscle. Bear them in mind. Make sure you're doing the things that I said, and your plan will be good. So next, let's look at this word that gets used a lot. So it's called progressive overload. So what is progressive overload? Progressive overload is a process in which you continually increase the workload you do in a session, a week, or a month, or even in a year. The principle is that in order to continually build muscle and improve your physique, you need to be constantly doing more, and every avid gym goer understands this principle, but doesn't necessarily understand how to go about ensuring it. As most people think, like in the image up here, you just increase the load every time. But you've got to remember that you can strength increases are not linear, so they do not just keep going up and up and up and up. At some point you will stall, and then you might go up again. So then you would look at other ways to create progressive overload. So there's 12 kind of ways you can progressively overload. So some are easier to understand and some are a little bit more kind of out there, not necessarily applicable. So let's get into them. So you could lift the same load with an increased range of motion. So you could increase your range of motion. It means you're lifting the weight through a longer range. You could lift the same load and volume with better form, more control, or less effort. You could lift the same load for the more reps, so that's a volume progression. You could lift heavier loads, which is an intensity progression. You could lift the same load and volume with less rest time in between sets. Lifting a load with more speed and acceleration. You could do more work in the same amount of time. You could do the same work in the less amount of time. You could do more sets with the same load and reps, so that's volume again. You could lift the same load and volume more often throughout the week. You could do the same work while losing body mass. You could lift the same load and volume and then extending the set past mechanical failure with force reps, negatives, rest pauses, and post-exhaustions. But that's a little bit more complex. So, like I said, progressive overload is never linear. However, you need to think how you can create this over a long period of time. So whenever you step in the gym, on the track, go for a run, you want to be getting better. You want to be getting faster. You want to be getting stronger in some shape or form. Because that means you're improving, you're creating a new adaptive response for your muscle to adapt to and then get better from. So that's progressive overload explained in kind of a nutshell. I'm whizzing through this because I'm aware that we're already at 12 minutes. So I've used some of this terminology just a minute ago and I realized that I hadn't explained it to you, so I'm going to go through it now. So I use the word volume. People, your coaches will use the word volume. And volume basically means the reps you do, so how many times you lift the weight up and down, and the weight you use. This is used to then calculate how much volume you're doing. Volume can also be recorded by the number of sets you do per session per muscle group across a given amount of time. So for example, your coach might say that you do 30 sets in a month for your legs, and then once you've got used to that, you might go up to 31 sets for the next month, and so on and so forth. These are kind of things that your coach will know, should know, they should know this, where you might not necessarily need to know. You just need to be aware that these all influence your training program. Frequency, don't know why I've done that. Frequency, so frequency basically refers to how many times a week you train a muscle. So certain muscle groups can be trained more, like smaller muscle groups like the biceps and the triceps, whereas bigger muscle groups that involve kind of more motor units may struggle with the higher frequencies, just because they often entail much more load, so much more weight lifted, and then they will need much more recovery time. As a general rule of thumb, you want to be training each muscle group for a minimum of 2 times per week, as this capitalizes on the time frame that we know it takes for you to recover from a stimulus, which is around kind of 48 hours. So if you fit in 2 training sessions for the same muscle group a week, that will give you enough time to recover, adapt, and then you can create the next stimulus again. So intensity. Intensity is often measured on a thing called an RPE scale. So an RPE scale is a 1 to 10 scale. 1 means that you're sat doing nothing, like now. Even though it's quite hot, it's probably a 1. And then 10 would be a maximal effort training. So that could be like a 100-meter sprint or a max rep deadlift. Something to bear in mind with this is that high intensity training often means that you need to recover just as much, if not more. And it also might mean that you need to deload sooner. And a deload in the fancy terms basically means rest, prolonged periods of rest. So for example, if you train for 6 weeks, you would normally have a 1-week deload. If you train in the high intensity kind of way, you might need to deload sooner based on your recovery capabilities. So next one is load. Load simply means how much weight you're lifting, how much weight is on the bar, how much weight is in your hands. Based on the progressive overload that we've spoken about, we want this to be increasing over time. Obviously, it won't just skyrocket up. We want it to creep up over time. Don't get disheartened. Just remember that patience and consistency are key in this. Now, these things here you will need to know. So reps will be on whatever training program you follow. So your coach or the thing you download from the internet will tell you how many reps you need to do. Reps means how many times you're going to lift the weight within a set. So a set then means how many times you're going to do that number of reps. So for example, your coach may say, please can you do 3 sets of 10 reps? So one set would be 10 reps. So you'd lift the weight up 10 times, then you'd rest, then you'd do 10 times again. That would be the second set. You'd rest, you do 10 more reps, and that would be your third set. So that's sets and reps. And then tempo. So there's the numbers here. So tempo relates to the speed you perform an exercise. So the first number here is always the first part of whatever movement you're doing. So for example, on a squat, this would be the lowering phase or the eccentric phase. The 2 would represent the pause in the middle, and the 1 would be the concentric phase. And then the 0 would be the rest at the top. The same with the bench press. So the bench press would be 1, 2, 3, 2 second pause, so 1, 2, and then a 1 second concentric. And then 0 rest at the top. So those are some of the things I think you need to know for your training plans, and obviously for the training plans that I'm going to upload into the group. Into the group? What am I on about? Into the community on this course. So, example training programs. So for a beginner, you can get away with doing a little bit more, and you need to focus kind of on accumulating volume. So you wouldn't expect to be able to write an essay the first time you spend an hour doing an essay. So you cannot go into the gym and expect to be able to do the volume and the weights that people who've been training for 10 years can do. Just like that, you need to work your way up. So higher frequency, full body, 3 to 4 times a week would be perfect for a beginner to get you going, to get your progression, to get your consistency. Likewise, you could do an upper lower split. So upper lower rest, upper lower. That is a good split that I've run with clients of my own. And then as we go to more intermediate and advanced, I know it's very hard to determine whether you're intermediate or advanced. I would class myself as intermediate, and I've been training 10 years because I'm not necessarily the most advanced trainer. You could try a push-pull legs rotation. So push would be all pushing movements, so chest, shoulders and triceps. Pull would be pulling movements, mostly all to do with your back and your biceps. And then legs or lower body are self-explanatory. Then you can kind of go into a hybrid, which is a push-pull lower, upper lower. We're getting a little bit fancy there, but remember, I'll be uploading training programs into the group so you can do them, try them for yourselves. Okay, and so lastly, so what next? What do you do next? So apply what you've learned. So the best way to do this, I would think, would make sure you've taken notes on this kind of lecture. Next, you want to be looking at programs you've done before in the gym or program you're doing at the moment and seeing, am I doing the 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy? Because if not, I might not be doing everything I can to grow muscle. That's applying what you've learned today. Practice what you've learned. So maybe go over this seminar again, make notes, dive into the terminology a little bit more, read some articles, watch YouTube videos. People are great on there. Jeff Nippard's pretty good. Evaluate what you've learned is next. So evaluate what you've learned. Evaluate on what you've used before. And this then relates to reflect. So have how you've trained previously facilitated your goal. If yes, carry on doing them. You might be able to improve them even more. If no, you need to be thinking about how you can change that. Because there's no point learning things and not using them to reflect on what we've done previously to improve them. And remember, we can always improve. So if you enjoyed this, I hope it was okay. Any questions, let me know in the community, comments below. Peace.